In today's video, we cover a gang from Liverpool that helped to poison the Rice Lane area and the surrounding communities with the supply of drugs and guns. A Skorpion submachine gun doesn't look particularly menacing at first glance. It's compact, almost toy-like in its proportions, small enough to fit inside a rucksack alongside a few changes of clothes or a pair of trainers. But what it lacks in size, it more than compensates for in lethality. The weapon fires 9mm rounds at a rate of several hundred per minute, and when it's pointed at your home or your body, the difference between a submachine gun and something larger becomes entirely academic. In the spring of 2022, this particular Skorpion was used twice within the space of a week to spray bullets across residential streets in Liverpool. Then it vanished, swallowed up by the city's criminal underworld, tucked away in a safe house where it could wait, loaded and ready for the next time someone needed it. What makes this story particularly unsettling isn't just the violence itself, but the casual infrastructure that surrounded it. The gun didn't disappear into some high-security vault or the home of a criminal mastermind. Instead, it ended up wrapped in a tea towel, stuffed inside a black Under Armour rucksack, hidden in the bathroom of a flat in Walton, controlled by a drug user named Anthony Bosanquet. The DNA of two other men, both of them users who had purchased drugs from the same supply line, was later found on the weapon. These weren't hardened gangsters in the traditional sense. They were people caught up in the gravitational pull of the Rice Lane drug dealing operation, a network that moved heroin and cocaine through the streets of North Liverpool, whilst simultaneously serving as the custodians of deadly weapons. And at the centre of it all was Scott Howard, a 35-year-old man who had become, in the words of the prosecution, the head of the Rice Lane drug-dealing fraternity. The first shooting happened in April 2022 on Deverell Grove in Wavertree. The victim was a woman in her 50s named Beverly Tynan, who was shot in the leg. The circumstances surrounding the attack remain opaque, as they so often do in cases like these. But what is known is that her son, Charlie Tynan, was subsequently convicted of offences relating to his involvement in the supply of Class A drugs. Whether the shooting was a warning, an act of revenge, or something else entirely, the outcome was the same. A woman was injured, a family was torn apart, and the Skorpion submachine gun that had caused the damage simply moved on to its next target. That target came roughly a week later, on the beach walk in Stonycroft. This time, the gun was fired through the front window of a house belonging to Jason Hughes, who was also later convicted of being involved in the production and supply of cannabis. Again, the motivations remain unclear. What's evident, though, is the pattern. The weapon was being used to settle scores, to send messages, to enforce the unspoken rules of a criminal economy that operates parallel to the legitimate one. And after each use, it had to be hidden away, kept safe and ready for the next time it was needed. Enter Anthony Bosanquet, known to his associates as Boz. He was a customer of the Wong Line, one of the two drug supply chains that Howard and his partner, Anthony Nelson, operated out of the Rice Lane area. The lines, whimsically named Wong and Won Chin, had been active since at least the end of 2022, supplying heroin and cocaine to users across North Liverpool. Bosanquet's role in the operation wasn't that of a dealer or a lieutenant. He was a user, someone lower down the food chain. But he had something that made him valuable. He had access to a flat on Grey Road in Walton, a place that could serve as a safe house. And on the 2nd of March, 2023, when Merseyside police raided that flat, they found the Skorpion wrapped in its tea towel, nestled inside the Under Armour rucksack in the bathroom. Alongside it were a silencer and loaded magazines. Bosanquet, who had been previously jailed for 5.5 years after pleading guilty to possession of a firearm and possession of cannabis and cannabis resin with intent to supply, was back in custody. But the investigation was only just beginning. The DNA evidence recovered from the Skorpion told a story of its own. Two men, Gary Bell and Stephen Moore, had both left traces of themselves on the weapon. Bell, a 48-year-old from Northfield Road in Bootle, had 37 previous convictions for 74 offences. Moore, 53 and of no fixed address, had an even longer record with 47 convictions for 90 offences. Both men were drug users. Both had purchased from the Wong line, and both had, at some point, handled the submachine gun. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They had been involved in either the storage or the movement of the weapon before it was recovered. They were useful, trusted even, in the way that people who are dependent on drugs can be useful to those who supply them. They had access to places, to people, to networks that might otherwise be closed off. And so, when the Skorpion needed to be moved or hidden, they were enlisted to help. But the story doesn't end with the Skorpion. If anything, that was just the beginning. On the evening of the 19th of April, 2023, Scott Howard was spotted in woodland near Rice Lane Recreation Ground in the company of another man. A police helicopter was deployed and officers traced their movements towards the Liverpool Loop line. The second man managed to escape on an electric bicycle, disappearing into the urban sprawl. But Howard was arrested on foot. He was carrying a pair of gloves and a balaclava, items that suggested he wasn't out for an evening stroll. When officers searched the woods, they found an abandoned bike and a rucksack containing a canister of petrol. Hidden in a nearby bush was another gun, a Zoraki 917 blank-firing handgun that had been converted to discharge 9mm caliber ammunition. A silencer had been fitted to this weapon as well, transforming it from a relatively harmless starting pistol into something far more dangerous. Howard's criminal history stretched back years. He had 18 previous convictions for 29 offenses, including a 2-year sentence for possession of heroin and cannabis, with intent to supply back in 2007. But it wasn't just drug dealing that occupied his time. In 2021, whilst serving a prison sentence, he had become embroiled in a scheme to smuggle contraband into HMP Liverpool using drones. The operation was uncovered on the 20th of December that year, when guards noticed a drone flying near the prison. When the device was seized, it was found to have made 3 previous flights into Walton Prison. Attached to it was a package containing 62 grams of cannabis, which had a street value of between £350 and £500 on the outside, but was worth between £3,100 and £4,650 inside the prison. Quantities of tobacco worth £20 to £50 outside skyrocketed in value to between £2,800 and £3,150 once inside. A mobile phone attached to the drone contained records of a total of 31 flights into the establishment. A second drone recovered during the investigation had made 6 trips into HMP Liverpool from November 2021 onwards. In total, the conspiracy was estimated to have been responsible for contraband worth between £236,000 and £312,000 flown into the jail over an 8-month period. It was an audacious scheme, one that spoke to Howard's ambition and his willingness to exploit any opportunity for profit, even from inside a prison cell. But ambition, in this context, is a double-edged sword. The same drive that enabled Howard to run a profitable drug supply operation and orchestrate a drone smuggling conspiracy also made him reckless. By the time he was arrested in the woods near Rice Lane Recreation Ground, he was already on bail for other offences, and yet there he was, in possession of gloves, a balaclava, and within arm's reach of a loaded, silenced handgun. It was the kind of behaviour that suggests either desperation or a profound inability to learn from past mistakes. The other members of the Rice Lane operation were a mixed group, united not by any grand criminal vision, but by circumstance, addiction, and the lure of easy money. Terry Riley, 34, of Glan Aber Park in West Derby, had 20 previous court appearances for 45 offences, though none since 2017. He had spent years in a steady relationship, working as a chef in a public house, and trying to stay on the straight and narrow. But when the pub closed down and he was laid off, the temptation of earning a dishonest income proved too strong. He became a lieutenant in the Wong Line operation, trusted to manage and control the graft phone on behalf of Howard and Nelson. It was his first stint in adult detention, and it came at a cost. His relationship with his partner didn't survive his incarceration, though he maintained contact with his 7-year-old son, a relationship to which he attached great significance. Liam Duffy, 28, of Radmore Road in Knotty Ash, had an even more extensive record, 8 convictions for 18 offences, including possession of heroin and cocaine with intent to supply in 2014, possession of heroin and crack cocaine with intent to supply in 2016, and conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine in 2018. He had 3 children with his partner, who worked as a care assistant for elderly people and young children. The children had neurodiversity issues, and Duffy had looked after them well when he was around. He had even run a gardening business for a time, but when it collapsed, he fell back into old habits, returning to the drug trade with an ease that spoke to how deeply ingrained those patterns had become. By the time of his sentencing, he had spent approximately 7 years of his life in custody. He was still only 28. Gary Bell and Stephen Moore, the 2 men whose DNA was found on the Skorpion, were in many ways the most tragic figures in the entire operation. Bell was a vulnerable man with a long-standing addiction to controlled drugs. The prosecution couldn't say how long the prohibited weapon had been in his possession, and the evidence suggested that the firearm had been taken to his address by a third person. He wasn't in the best of health, and during his time in custody, his partner had died, causing him immense grief. To his credit, he had managed to rid himself of his addiction and intended to put his offending behind him. Though whether that intention would survive the years ahead remained to be seen. Moore's situation was similarly bleak. He was homeless at the time of his involvement with the Skorpion, and it was never entirely clear when or how he had come into contact with the gun. What was clear was that his contact with it had been brief, perhaps only a single day. He had a difficult time in custody, and because he had pleaded guilty, rumors or accusations had made his life inside even harder. Both of his parents were deceased, and his desire was to move out of Liverpool entirely, to escape the city that had brought him nothing but misery. Like Bell, he was now off the drugs that had consumed so much of his life, but the future remained uncertain. At the top of the conspiracy, or at least at the top of the particular branch that Howard and Nelson controlled, was a man named Terence Clark. Clark had used the EncroChat handle, Sacred Truck, before the encrypted communications platform was infiltrated by French police in 2020. Even after that infiltration, he continued his criminality, operating as the upstream supplier for the Wong and Wan Chin graph lines. He was involved in the supply of controlled drugs within Liverpool at a high level, moving very large amounts of Class A drugs through the city. The overall conspiracy he was involved in was sophisticated and had been running for years, with Howard and Nelson operating as one of several sub-branches. When the case finally came before Liverpool Crown Court, the defendants appeared in various states of resignation and defiance. Howard, wearing a black Givenchy jumper, was convicted of conspiracy to possess a prohibited firearm in relation to the Skorpion submachine gun. He had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of possession of a prohibited firearm, namely the Zoraki handgun and silencer, possession of ammunition without a certificate, conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine, and 3 charges of conspiracy to convey prohibited articles into a prison. He was jailed for 21 years and 2 months. Duffy, wearing a grey Monterex tracksuit, stood with his arms folded as he was handed 8 years behind bars for conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine. Riley, in a black North Face tracksuit top, nodded and gave a thumbs up to the judge as he was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for the same offence. Moore, in a brown and yellow zip-up top, and Bell, in a navy blue castor coat, were locked up for 5 and 6 years, respectively, for conspiracy to possess a prohibited firearm. Judge David Swinnerton, in his sentencing remarks, was careful to distinguish between the various roles each defendant had played. He made it clear that none of them were being accused of involvement in the actual shootings that had taken place in April and May of 2022, but he also emphasized the seriousness of what they had done. The Skorpion had been used to cause harm, and after those shootings, it had to be stored somewhere. That's the purpose of safehouses, he explained, to store firearms, ammunition, or drugs at arm's length from those at the head of criminal operations. The flat on Grey Road was one such place, and Bell and Moore had been useful in the storage or movement of the gun before it was recovered. To Howard, the judge was particularly direct. You came to assist that group in looking after, hiding, keeping safe, keeping available, keeping out of the hands of the police, the Skorpion, he said. In doing that, you had the help of others around that Rice Lane drug-dealing fraternity. He also addressed Howard's conduct whilst on bail, his arrest in the woods near Rice Lane Recreation Ground, and the discovery of the second firearm. There cannot be many people in this city who are unaware of the potential effects of a Skorpion being fired, Judge Swinnerton continued. What you have been doing risks devastating other people's families, both because of the impacts of Class A drugs and the potential for devastation by having lethal firearms hidden, ready for use on the streets of Liverpool. Howard had written a letter to the court expressing remorse. His barrister, Jonathan Duffy, spoke of how the passage of time and separation from his family had caused him to realize the effect his actions had had on them and on his relationship with them. The family was close, with young children, one of whom had difficulties. Howard understood that he was going to be separated from his family for a further significant period, and he claimed that he never intended to offend again. His barrister argued that he hadn't been directly involved in selling or distributing wholesale quantities of Class A drugs, that he was managing street-level lines, not operating at the highest level. There was no evidence of a lavish lifestyle or significant amounts of cash. He was dealing and selling relatively modest quantities at street level, but Judge Swinnerton wasn't swayed. You are going to miss a substantial chunk of your children's childhoods, he told Howard. That is a great shame to them. You can still be a good father to them, or you go back to prison and waste your life. The case of the Rice Lane drug-dealing fraternity is, in many ways, an example of how organized crime functions in modern Britain. It's not the slick, glamorous world depicted in films, with criminal masterminds orchestrating complex heists from penthouse apartments. It's grim and transactional, built on addiction, exploitation, and the constant threat of violence. The people involved aren't masterminds. They're often vulnerable, sometimes desperate, and almost always trapped in cycles of behavior that are extraordinarily difficult to break. And yet, for all their vulnerabilities, they are still capable of facilitating extraordinary harm. A Skorpion submachine gun doesn't fire itself. Someone has to pull the trigger. And before that can happen, someone has to store it, move it, keep it ready. That's the role that Howard and his associates played, and it's a role that Judge Swinnerton made clear warranted serious punishment. Anthony Nelson, Howard's partner in running the Wong and Won Chin lines, admitted conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine. The 28-year-old from Colquitt Street in Liverpool city centre was due to be sentenced the following Wednesday. His absence from the initial sentencing hearing was a reminder that cases like these are often sprawling affairs, involving multiple defendants, multiple hearings, and months or even years of legal wrangling. In the end, the story of the Rice Lane drug gang is a reminder of how deeply firearms have become embedded in Britain's drug economy. The Skorpion submachine gun, found in that Under Armour rucksack, wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a system, one that exists to protect profits, settle disputes, and enforce hierarchy. And as long as that system remains in place, the violence will continue. The names and faces may change, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Someone will always need a safe house. Someone will always be willing to provide one. And somewhere, wrapped in a tea towel or hidden in a bush, another weapon will be waiting for the next time it's needed.